I remember from our international politics course, we read this book right here, Us Versus Them, The Failure of Globalism by Ian Bremmer. And in that book, it mentions some examples about globalism from a more Eastern perspective. That when you have all of this international commerce going on and countries are able to communicate with each other more, there brings with it the possibility of destabilization.
So that's a really good point.
Considering that we are still in a global pandemic at a time when trade and communication are faster than ever before, and now that countries are more compact and citizens aren't moving around as much, do you think this has been a bad moment for those who would advocate globalism?
I think the general view is that the pandemic is likely to promote deglobalization and not globalization. That this is going to accelerate this period of deglobalization. So Brandon, you're raising a really good point. It seems as if in the last few years, we have been moving away from globalization to what you might call deglobalization. Trump's election represents that. The Brexit move represents that. And we're not seeing the rapid increase in trade that we had seen a few decades later. Actually, migration of peoples, that has even slowed despite fears of immigration in this country. So we've actually been seeing deglobalization for a few years. And it would seem to me that the pandemic is likely to accelerate that. There's going to be much less desire to travel internationally. This is probably going to curtail trade. I think that different companies are thinking about moving some of their operations closer to their home countries. So that's what it would seem like, that this will accelerate deglobalization and be a blow to globalization.
Yeah, and on that point, do you think the U.S. would begin more investing in, for example, countries in our hemisphere like South America, that would be a lot easier to trade from? To your point, companies wanting their production to be closer to home. Do you think that could be like a serious possibility in the next 50 years or so?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that we're seeing greater regionalism as part of this effort of deglobalization. So I think regionalism is going to be a primary feature in international politics. The other thing to keep in mind that I didn't mention is that it appears as if the US and China may be entering a kind of Cold War. And this may also enhance regionalism as well. So the US would kind of come to dominate the Western world a little bit more, and China the Far East. I think regionalism is definitely going to be a part of it. And as you probably have heard, several companies, U.S. companies, are thinking about pulling some of their operations out of China. And I think that they would be looking to move some of these operations closer to home, such as Latin America. So I think that's likely to happen.
Yeah, I think India is likely another big proponent for like foreign trade and where we would move our companies for cheap labor. But yeah, to your point, I think regionalism is like a growing trend, especially with China's like Belt and Road program. They're going to have a stronghold over the Far East. I mean, the Vietnam, Laos, that area, as well as even the Middle East. So, and they're already like exerting their influence on more minor countries.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And by the way, when you had geopolitical rivalries, and of course we haven't had much of that when the Cold War ended and we entered this new era. But when you have geopolitical rivalries, that does tend to promote greater regionalism. It tends to go against globalization in general. So I would throw in the geopolitical rivalry is also a factor that's probably going to decelerate globalization.
And I mean, like in your opinion, do you think that's a positive thing, or could that have just positives and negatives?
Well, I mean, it does it does force you to kind of ask yourself, like, well, what is your perspective? I mean, I tend to think that globalization is more positive than negative, but not everybody comes out a winner with respect to how we've been moving with respect to the kind of globalization that we had. I certainly don't think it's a good idea to have greater geopolitical rivalries, such as between the U.S. and China. I don't think that's really good for the world. But you know, I think that one of the big failures of globalization is a lot of Americans, to take our country, didn't really benefit. They lost their decent paying manufacturing jobs and ended up working or having to work in kind of low paying service sector jobs. So, you know, one of the arguments for globalization was that a country like the United States would kind of move up the economic ladder as we lost certain jobs in manufacturing. And for some people that happened, but for many other people that didn't happen, and they ended up falling into these kind of low-paying service sector jobs, as I said. So globalization hasn't been a winner for everybody. I think that has to be acknowledged. And I think that's a big reason why Trump was elected president in 2016.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, so for me, a trend I've noticed across history is that the United States always had like an outside force to be the center of its foreign policy. For example, Nazi Germany or the Soviet Union. Right nowadays is China and Russia. During the 90s, however, I find it very fascinating how there was a lack of a foreign power to be for the United States to unite against. So could you describe the foreign policy of the 90s during that time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think you could look at that period as a time in what you might call U.S. primacy. So political scientists like to debate, was the world kind of unipolar, meaning that there was one great power, or, you know, were we shifting to a more multipolar world? But I think most people think that in the 1990s, when the Cold War ended, that we basically saw the emergence of a unipolar world with one great power, the United States, dominating in so many different areas and spheres. And then one can kind of look at the early part of the 21st century as sort of some mini blows to this. So we had 9/11, then we had the financial crisis of 08 and 09, and then the election of Trump, which kind of goes against globalization, which the United States promoted in the 1990s. So, you know, President Bill Clinton was a huge proponent of free trade and opposition to protectionism. So this is kind of what the U.S. stood for in the 90s and has stood for a long time. This is why Trump's election in 2016 represents a kind of radical break in that departure. But I would say the period from the end of the Cold War to the 90s and to this day has seen kind of the emergence of one great superpower, the United States. Here we are in 2020, and we're sort of wondering, is this falling apart with, say, the emergence of China as another big superpower? And then what the United States seemed to stand for in the 90s and early part of the century, namely globalization, you know, that seems to be falling apart. And curiously enough, the country, the United States, that supported it seems not to be supporting it anymore, which is a very kind of strange state of affairs.
I just had a question on like Trump's America First policy. Do you think that a policy like that is perhaps accelerating a decline of an American hegemony? Like we sort of Trump specifically throws attacks at like NATO members and purposefully disparages some of our closest friends. Do you think that's detrimental to us at all?
Well, I mean, that is kind of open to opinion. I mean, Trump's would argue that America First is good for the United States. I think most people, most political scientists who study international relations would disagree. They would say that alliances, particularly pro-US alliances such as NATO, that's a good thing, that they enhance American power and standing in the world. And that in general, international organizations have tended to be dominated by the US. So I know President Trump recently pulled out of the WHO, but the U.S. has largely dominated the WHO. Maybe it didn't respond well in January of this year with respect to the pandemic crisis, and certainly relied on some information that China was giving the WHO. But in general, the U.S. and the WHO have had a very close relationship, and the U.S. has largely, I would say, to use the word, dominated it. So I would say if the U.S. pulls out of international organizations and sees the fraying of its alliances, that it probably puts the United States in a weaker position in the world, not a stronger position. But, that is open to debate. So Harvey, what do you think?
Well, personally, I think that I'd agree with a lot of the political scientists that pro-U.S. alliances are, well, beneficial for the U.S. While I may not agree with some of them, they are beneficial to the U.S. And America First policy in general sort of isolates ourselves from the international community and gives us a bad rep with a lot of other countries, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Snyder, for coming today. That was some very amazing discussion. We're glad that you agreed to come here today, and everybody here is incredibly thankful.
And I just want to wish you well and say how much I commend your effort to be so civically engaged at such a high level.
Yes, thank you so much. That is the mission. That is the purpose of the YACU. So I'm glad we can get somebody who's well versed on the subject, who's on board with it.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And it was good to be part of your group.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Snyder.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, take care.